She never threw a punch. She never raised her voice. She just smiled, and that smile brought down an entire command. A decorated combat medic, a classified Pentagon mission, a captain who thought he could erase her with the back of his hand. He was wrong. This is the story of Emily Carter, the woman they dismissed, humiliated, and forced out. The woman who had been watching them the whole time. Stay with me until the very end. If this story moves you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The smell of antiseptic and recycled air had become so ordinary to Emily Carter that she barely registered it anymore. 6 months inside Silver Creek Medical Center had a way of doing that, flattening everything into routine. Morning briefing at 0630, patient rounds by 0700, medication checks, wound care, the usual rhythm of a military installation's medical wing running on controlled chaos and institutional exhaustion. She liked it that way. Predictable, clean, nobody asking questions. Emily was 30 years old with the kind of face that didn't invite second looks. Brown hair usually pulled back into a low bun, no jewelry on shift, small hands that moved with practiced efficiency. Her civilian contractor badge read Emily Carter / registered nurse, Tier 2 medical support. She wore it clipped to her left breast pocket, the same spot she'd once worn a different kind of insignia. Nobody here knew about that. Most of the medical staff at Silver Creek thought she was quiet to the point of odd. She didn't join the lunch table gossip, didn't complain about the vending machine being down for 3 weeks, didn't perform outrage when supply requests got delayed by bureaucracy. She just worked. She clocked in, did her job, clocked out. Sergeant Yolanda Pruitt, a medical tech who'd been stationed here 4 years, once told her during a break that she moved like someone who already knows where everything is going to go wrong. Emily had smiled at that. Old habit, she'd said, and left it there. The trouble with Captain Nathan Briggs started the way most trouble did at Silver Creek, slowly and then all at once. Briggs ran administrative operations for the base's medical support division, which meant he had authority over contracting staff, supply allocation, and scheduling. He was 44, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that came from standing outside watching other people work rather than actually doing any. He'd been at this installation 14 months and had, in that time, developed a reputation that the permanent staff spoke about in lowered voices near the break room, and never in writing. Emily had observed him for 4 of those months. She'd watched the way he spoke to the younger nurses, not quite yelling, never quite crossing a documented line, but always with a particular edge, a way of standing too close, a way of emphasizing the word civilian that made it sound like a slur. She'd cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, quietly, thoroughly, without letting it show on her face. The morning it broke open was a Thursday in early March, gray sky outside, the HVAC system doing something wrong with the airflow in the East Corridor so that every room smelled slightly stale. Emily had flagged a medication dispensing discrepancy in Ward C. 3 patients had received the correct drugs, but at 15-minute intervals that didn't match the logged administration times. It wasn't an emergency. It wasn't even technically an error, but it was a pattern, and patterns mattered. She'd submitted the discrepancy report through the standard system at 0718. By 0900, Captain Briggs was standing in the doorway of the supply prep room where she was inventorying IV kits, and he wasn't there to discuss it calmly. "You want to explain this?" He held up a printout of her report, creased where he'd folded it, which meant he'd read it at least twice. Emily set down the clipboard. "The log times in Ward C don't match the... I know what it says." He stepped inside the room, letting the door fall mostly shut behind him. "What I'm asking is, what gave you the idea to file a discrepancy report on a licensed physician's documentation without bringing it to me first?" "The protocol is to submit directly through the system. I followed." "You embarrassed Dr. Okafor." "I documented a scheduling inconsistency." Briggs crossed his arms. There were 2 nurses from the day shift visible through the small window in the door, and Emily noted them the same way she noted most things, without looking directly. "You know what your problem is, Carter. You don't understand how things work here. You think because you fill out your little forms and show up on time, that makes you something. It doesn't. Your contract support. You're temporary. You don't get to decide what gets flagged and what doesn't. Emily kept her voice level. With respect, Captain, the reporting protocol doesn't distinguish between staff classifications. I filed the same form any nurse on this ward would file. His jaw tightened. I'm going to need you to think very carefully about whether you want to push this. She thought about it for exactly 1 second. I do. That was when his hand moved. It wasn't a punch. She registered that immediately, clinically. It was an open palm strike, directed at the folder she was holding, which connected with the side of her face when she didn't flinch away fast enough. The sound was sharp, too sharp for such a small room, and the IV kits on the shelf rattled. She stood very still. The door opened. The 2 nurses from the corridor were there, frozen. Behind them, a physician's assistant named Marcus Webb had his mouth open. Further down, at the end of the hall, Sergeant Pruitt was staring. Briggs seemed to register the audience a half-second too late. "Pack your things," he said, and his voice had gone flat and cold, the way people's voices go when they realize they've made a mistake and decide to commit to it anyway. "You're done here. I'll have your contractor clearance suspended by end of day." Emily picked up the inventory clipboard she'd set down. She set the folder neatly on the shelf beside the IV kits. She didn't touch her face, though it was still warm from the contact. She looked at Briggs directly. "I understand, Captain," she said. "We'll let the truth decide." She said it without sarcasm, without heat. It was just a sentence, just 8 words. But something in the way she said them made Marcus Webb step back slightly, and made Yolanda Pruitt, 20 feet down the corridor, press her lips together like she was trying not to say something she'd been saving up for a long time. Briggs walked out. Emily stood in the supply room for approximately 40 seconds after that. Then she picked up her clipboard and went back to the IV count. She wasn't packing anything. The thing about Silver Creek Medical Center was that it operated on a strange dual authority, half civilian contractor, half active duty, which meant the rumor networks moved at 2 different speeds and almost never synced up. By 1100, the civilian nursing staff knew something had happened in the East Corridor supply room. By 1130, the version circulating among the contracted technicians involved a shouting match and someone throwing a binder. By noon, 3 different accounts were in active circulation, and none of them were accurate. What nobody was talking about, because nobody knew, was the alert that had gone through the Pentagon's internal medical oversight system at 0918 that morning. Emily had sent it from the hospital's administrative terminal before she went back to the IV count. It was not a dramatic message. It was a form, actually, a specific form, one that existed in a database that most of the people at Silver Creek Medical Center didn't know was accessible through their system. It required a clearance level that wasn't listed on any visible authorization sheet. She'd filled it out the same way she'd done everything else in this building, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. By 1400, the response had already been routed through 2 field offices. Emily spent the afternoon doing exactly what she was scheduled to do. She completed patient rounds in wards B and D. She updated documentation. She ate half a sandwich from the cafeteria standing at the counter because there was no time to sit, which was normal. She answered a question from a young medic named Darren Ash about wound packing technique, demonstrating twice with the training kit until he had it right. "You're really patient," Darren told her, looking slightly surprised by this. "It matters," she said. "If you rush this, someone bleeds out." He nodded like she'd told him something important. She had, but not in the way he thought. At 1545, Captain Briggs's administrative assistant sent Emily a formal notification that her contractor access was under review and that she should report to the administrative office the following morning to return her badge. She read the email, closed it, finished her documentation. At 1610, Yolanda Pruitt found her in the locker room pulling on her jacket. "You okay?" Yolanda asked. She was a woman who asked questions with her whole face, every expression visible. Emily considered the question. "Yeah." "What he did?" Yolanda started. "I know. I can write a statement. Webb was there. Holloway from the night shift saw part of it from—" "Yolanda," Emily zipped up her jacket. "If you want to write a statement, do it the right way. Through the official reporting channel, document the date, time, what you observed. Don't send it to Briggs's office. Yolanda stared at her. Where would I send it? Emily picked up her bag. The system will route it correctly. She walked out into the parking lot. The sky was doing that gray to orange thing that happens some evenings in this part of the country, where the clouds turned unexpected colors before dark. She sat in her car for about 3 minutes without starting it. Then she pulled out her personal phone and sent a single text to a number saved under the name D. Walsh. Clock is running. The reply came back in under a minute. Confirmed. ETA 0600. She started the car. Captain Briggs finished filing the contractor suspension paperwork at 17:30 and sent it upward with a satisfaction that felt almost physical. He'd been precise about it, careful language, documented the medication report incident as inappropriate escalation of minor procedural matter, characterized Emily's conduct as insubordinate and disruptive to unit cohesion. He'd left out the part about his hand. He'd left it out because in his experience, things left out ceased to exist. He told himself this over dinner, which he ate at the officers' club with 2 men from logistics who agreed with everything he said. He told himself this at 2100 when he watched some television. He told himself this at 5:45 the next morning before his alarm went off, because he'd woken early for reasons he didn't want to examine. At 5:57, he heard something. It started as a sound that was almost weather, a low percussion that you registered in your chest before your ears, the kind that made dogs go still. By 0600, it was clearly rotors, multiple sets, the particular frequency of military spec transport, not the light utility birds that occasionally passed over the base perimeter. Briggs stood at his window. 2 Black Hawk helicopters touched down on the base's eastern landing pad, which was used for exactly 3 categories of arrival: medical emergency, senior command visits, and classified operational movements. These weren't medevac birds. Wrong configuration, wrong markings. The kind of markings that meant federal, not just Army. 3 vehicles were already at the main gate. Briggs checked his phone. Nothing. He checked his email. 1 new message, time-stamped 055-8, from the base commanding officer's administrative account. All non-essential personnel, stand by in assigned areas. No departures from installation until further notice. This directive is effective immediately. He read it twice. By the time he was dressed and across the base, there were people in the administrative corridor he didn't recognize. 3 in Army investigation dress, 2 in civilian suits that had federal office written all over them, and 1 woman in a uniform with insignia that put her above anyone currently stationed at Silver Creek. She was in her 50s, with the kind of stillness that came from having been in rooms far worse than this one. She was standing outside the door of Colonel Hartwell's office, and she had a folder in her hand. Briggs approached because not approaching would have looked like something. "Captain Briggs," said one of the Army investigators. Not a question. "Yes." He was careful about his tone. "What's the situation?" "We'll get to that." The investigator, a major named, as Briggs would learn, Denise Tolland, looked at him the way people look at something they've already finished deciding about. "We're going to need you to stay in the building." "I have administrative duties in the building, Captain." He stayed. What? Colonel Victor Hartwell, who commanded Silver Creek Medical Center's installation operations, was a man who had survived 3 decades of military bureaucracy by being very good at understanding which way power was moving and adjusting accordingly. When Major Tolland placed Emily Carter's full personnel file on his desk at 0640, he went very still in a way that had nothing to do with calm. He read the first page twice, then the second. The file wasn't what anyone would have expected from a quiet nurse with a Tier 2 contractor badge. The Emily Carter in this file had deployed 3 times. She had a combat medic badge earned in conditions the file described in 3 lines that were still partially redacted. She had commendations from 2 different field commanders. She had cross-training in medical intelligence assessment that almost nobody outside specific DoD channels even knew existed as a designation. And she had, as of 8 months ago, been assigned as a confidential evaluator under the Department of Defense's Medical Installation Review Program, a program whose existence wasn't classified but whose personnel certainly were. She had been evaluating Silver Creek Medical Center since her first day. The medication discrepancy report she'd filed yesterday wasn't an escalation. It was documentation. It was the kind of documentation that, in context, meant something entirely different than Briggs had assumed. "Nobody leaves this installation," Major Tollin told Hartwell, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who isn't repeating themselves. "Every staff member who was in the East Corridor yesterday, between 800 and 1000, is going to be interviewed. All security footage is being transferred to our technical team. Captain Briggs's administrative records are being pulled as of this morning." Hartwell looked down at the file. "How long has she been here?" "Long enough," Tollin said. In the East Corridor of the medical wing, Yolanda Pruitt was giving her statement to a federal agent who took notes without breaking eye contact. Marcus Webb had already given his. Two other nurses were waiting in the break room, neither of them saying much. Down the hall, in a small conference room that had been cleared and requisitioned without warning, Emily Carter sat across from a woman she hadn't seen in 2 years, Colonel Adrienne Moss, her DoD program supervisor, and drank coffee that was bad even by military standards. "You filed the alert before or after?" Moss asked. "After." Emily wrapped both hands around the cup. "Wanted it documented in real time. You let him strike you." It wasn't quite a question. Emily thought about how to answer it. "I didn't anticipate the physical escalation. I did anticipate that he would escalate." Moss studied her. "You could have identified yourself. Ended it before it got there." "The evaluation wasn't complete." "Emily." "It wasn't complete." She met Moss's eyes without flinching. "I needed another 2 weeks minimum. There were patterns I hadn't fully documented yet. If I'd revealed my assignment, everything would have locked down and we'd have half a picture." Moss was quiet for a moment. "We have more than half a picture now." "Yes," Emily said. "We do." Outside, the base was doing the thing installations do when something large and unexpected happens. Everybody moving with slightly too much purpose, people finding reasons to be near windows, the particular frequency of anxiety that comes from authority arriving without warning. In the administrative building, Captain Nathan Briggs sat in a chair outside Colonel Hartwell's office and waited. He'd asked twice what was happening. Both times the answer had been, "Someone will be with you shortly." His suspension paperwork for Emily Carter was somewhere in the system. He thought about this. He thought about the helicopters. He thought about the woman's face after his hand had connected with the folder, and her cheek. The absolute stillness of it, the way she hadn't flinched, hadn't cried, hadn't even looked away. We'll let the truth decide. He hadn't understood what that meant when she said it. He was beginning to. At 0840, Major Tollin walked into the small anteroom where he'd been waiting and set a folder on the table in front of him. She sat down across from him and folded her hands. "Captain Briggs," she said, "I'd like to start with the incident in the supply room yesterday morning. I'm going to need you to walk me through it in your own words, and I want to be clear before you begin." She tapped the folder. "We have footage." Briggs looked at the folder. He'd left the thing with his hand out of the paperwork because in his experience, things left out ceased to exist. The camera in the East Corridor supply room had been installed as part of a medication security upgrade 3 months ago. It was documented in the base's facilities records. He had approved that upgrade. He had forgotten about the camera. His mouth went dry in a way that had nothing to do with the recycled air or the early morning. Tollin waited. She was very good at waiting. "It wasn't..." He started and started again. "The contact was incidental. I was handling a document and..." "Captain." Tollin's voice didn't change register. "I said we have footage." The room was very quiet. Down the hall, through 2 walls, Emily Carter finished her coffee, stood up, and went to check on her patients. Ward C was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that only existed in medical facilities between the early rush and the mid-morning chaos. Machines cycling, someone down the hall clearing their throat, the soft percussion of a keyboard from the nurse's station. Emily moved through it the same way she always did, checking lines, adjusting drip rates, reading faces before she read charts. Bed 4 was a sergeant named Kowalski, mid-40s, recovering from a knee reconstruction. He was awake when she came in, which wasn't unusual. He'd been sleeping badly since admission. "Heard some noise this morning," he said. Not quite a question. Helicopters on the east pad. Emily checked his drain output without looking up from the chart. Nothing that affects your recovery. Didn't look like a drill. No, she agreed. It didn't. He watched her work for a moment. You okay? You've got something on your face. She glanced up. He was looking at the left side of her jaw, which was probably still showing color from the morning. She'd checked it briefly in the restroom mirror. Not bruising yet, but the skin was faintly irritated, visible if you were paying attention. I'm fine, she said. That's not really an answer. It's the one I have right now. She made a note in the chart, recapped the pen. Your drain looks good. Physical therapy is scheduled for 1400. Don't skip it. He nodded slowly, still watching her. Whatever's going on, you look like someone who's got it handled. She didn't respond to that, but she didn't dismiss it either. She moved to the next bed. The thing about continuing to work was that it wasn't performance. She genuinely had patience. Kowalski's drain needed monitoring. The woman in bed 7, a specialist named Reyes, had a fever trending upward that Emily had flagged in the overnight notes and wanted to reassess in person. The work didn't stop because federal investigators had taken over the administrative wing. If anything, the work was the only part of the morning that made complete sense. By the time she finished rounds, it was nearly 1,000, and the base outside the medical wing's windows had taken on a particular texture. Too many unfamiliar vehicles, too many people moving with the specific purposeful tension of people who were not stationed here. A group of 4 walked past the window, 2 in civilian suits, 2 in uniform with investigation credentials visible on lanyards. One of them was on the phone. None of them looked up. Marcus Webb found her at the medication prep station at 10:15. He was 28, a PA who'd been at Silver Creek 14 months, and he had the look of someone who had been running scenarios in his head since 0600 and hadn't landed on a comfortable one. Emily, he glanced both ways down the corridor. There's an agent in the break room who wants to talk to the staff from yesterday. I know. They asked specifically about you. I know that too. He lowered his voice. What's going on? Who are these people? Because Briggs is sitting outside Hartwell's office and he looks... Webb stopped, started again. He looks scared. Emily sealed the medication tray. When the agent asks you what you saw yesterday, tell them exactly what you saw. Not what you think happened, not what you've heard since. What you saw in the order you saw it. I know how to give the statement. Then you're fine. Webb stood there another moment. He had something else he wanted to say and wasn't sure how to say it. I should have done something yesterday. When it happened, I froze. Emily looked at him then, directly, not the clinical assessment she gave most people. You're doing something now. He left, and she finished prepping the medication tray, and she thought about the 14 months she'd spent watching people at this installation make small decisions that accumulated into something larger. The way Briggs spoke in hallways. The way complaints disappeared into Hartwell's administrative system and resurfaced months later reclassified as resolved without any record of resolution. The 2 nurses who'd transferred out in the fall, the physician's assistant before Webb, who'd requested reassignment in the spring, whose exit interview notes contained language that had been redacted before filing. She'd documented all of it, every piece. Major Denise Tollin had been in Army investigations for 11 years, which meant she'd sat across from a lot of people who were lying to her and a smaller number of people who were telling the truth in ways that made the lies more visible by contrast. She had, over those 11 years, developed a specific sense for when a room was about to change, not a dramatic instinct, nothing cinematic about it, just the accumulation of small signals that her brain had learned to weight correctly. The room with Captain Nathan Briggs was changing. He'd asked for a lawyer 9 minutes into the interview. That was his right, and she'd stopped immediately and had him escorted to a separate waiting area, which was procedure. What wasn't procedure was the way his hands had been on the table. Not fidgeting, not still, but pressing down flat against the surface like he was trying to keep them from doing something. She'd seen that before. It meant the body remembered something the mind was trying to reframe. The footage from the East Corridor supply room was 47 seconds long and required very little interpretation. The angle was high left, designed for medication security, which meant it captured the full width of the room and both occupants clearly. The contact between Briggs's hand and the side of Emily Carter's face was unambiguous. The folder was visible. The trajectory was visible. The impact was visible. More relevant to Tolland's current interests was what happened in the 11 seconds after. Emily Carter stood without moving, without touching her face, without changing her expression in any way that the camera could read as distress. She set the folder down. She looked at Briggs. She said something that the audio, limited quality, equipment not rated for recording, didn't fully capture, but the lip reader Tolland had already requested would render within the hour. She'd seen a lot of people on the receiving end of something like that. Most of them moved, stepped back, turned away, reached for their face without thinking. The body's reflex to protect itself was hard to override. Carter hadn't moved at all. Tolland added that to the growing file of things about Emily Carter that required more consideration than they'd initially been allocated. She took the footage and the witness statements that had come in through the morning, Webb, Pruitt, a contracted supply tech named Holloway who'd caught the tail end of it from the corridor, and added them to the stack on the conference table that had been converted into her working space. Then she pulled the second folder, the one that had nothing to do with the incident in the supply room. It was labeled, in the dry language of institutional documentation, Administrative Complaint Log, Silver Creek Medical Center, Contractor and Enlisted Personnel, 14 months. It was 31 pages long. The individual complaints were not, taken alone, catastrophic. A nurse who felt she'd been spoken to inappropriately. A medic who believed his evaluation had been scored punitively after a scheduling disagreement with Briggs. 2 enlisted personnel who'd submitted formal concerns about working conditions in the administrative support wing and received responses that characterized their concerns as misunderstandings. A contracted physician's assistant, the one before Webb, who had requested emergency reassignment in March and whose personnel notes described a conflict with supervisory staff without further detail. Tolland had seen complaint logs before. She knew what active suppression looked like versus passive neglect. This was neither. This was something more specific, complaints that made it into the system, were acknowledged at the lowest possible level, and then stopped moving. Hartwell's signature appeared on several of the resolution forms. The resolutions described as having occurred often lacked any documentation of what that resolution had actually involved. The agent she'd assigned to cross-reference complaint dates with personnel transfer dates came back at 10:45. 7 transfers in the past 14 months, he told her. 3 enlisted, 4 contracted, all voluntary on paper. 2 of them transferred within 30 days of filing a complaint. Requested destination? 5 out of 7 requested assignments that took them off this installation entirely. Tolland looked at the ceiling for a moment. Pull the exit interview files. Already working on it. She was halfway through the 3rd page of the complaint log when one of her team leads, a compact woman named Agent CO, came in and set a single sheet of paper on the table without preamble. "We have a problem," CO said, "specifically a pattern problem." Tolland read the sheet. It was a preliminary cross-reference. Briggs's duty history against complaint records from his 2 previous installations. She read it once, then again. "How long has this been accumulating?" she asked. 7 years, CO said. "Different installations, different personnel, same signature on the complaints. Resolved, resolved, resolved." She paused. Nobody connected the dots because nobody was looking at the whole picture. Tolland set the sheet down. Emily Carter's evaluation covered this installation only. "Yes. But this," she tapped the page. "This is a DOD level pattern, which means our mandate just expanded." Tolland was quiet for a moment. Outside the window of the converted conference room, she could see the eastern landing pad, the Blackhawks sitting quiet now, their rotors still. The base was locked down efficiently, people in their assigned areas, the kind of compliance that came from understanding that something significant was happening without being told the specifics. "Get me the files from his previous installations," she said. "All of them." Seo was already moving. Yolanda Pruitt gave her statement at 11:10 to an investigator named Agent Ramos. who had the careful, neutral manner of someone trained to make people comfortable enough to tell the truth. Yolanda was not a person who needed to be made comfortable. She'd been waiting to say these things for months, and the primary challenge was not running out of space. She described what she'd seen in the East Corridor. She described the sound, that sharp, wrong sound from inside the supply room, and the way it had made her stop walking. She described Carter's face in the doorway afterward. No tears, no shaking, just that absolute composure that Yolanda had found either impressive or unnerving, depending on the day. Then Ramos asked her about other incidents, not with Carter specifically, with the general climate on the ward over the past year. Yolanda took a breath. She talked for 22 minutes. She talked about the nurse who'd transferred in November, who'd cried in the locker room the day before she left and wouldn't say why. She talked about the scheduling irregularities that always seemed to hit the same people. She talked about the supply requests that went missing when they came from certain staff members and sailed through when they came from others. She talked about the meeting in September where Briggs had told the nursing staff, in language careful enough to be deniable, that contracted personnel who created unnecessary friction shouldn't expect their contracts to be renewed. She hadn't filed any of this. She knew how to file. She'd been in the Army 8 years. She understood the reporting structure. But she'd also seen what happened to the people who filed. And she had 2 kids and a mortgage, and she'd made a choice she wasn't proud of. I should have said something earlier, she told Ramos. He didn't tell her it was okay, which she appreciated. He just wrote down what she'd said and moved to the next question. Down the hall, in a conference room that had been converted to a secondary interview space, a contracted supply technician named Holloway was describing a pattern of inventory irregularities that had started 8 months ago. Supplies requisitioned under legitimate codes for quantities that didn't match patient census numbers. He'd flagged it to his direct supervisor, who'd filed it upward, where it had apparently evaporated. Nobody had told Holloway that this information was going to be relevant to a federal investigation. He'd come in expecting to give a statement about what he'd seen in the corridor yesterday and had been mildly surprised when the questions expanded well beyond that. I have the requisition records, he told the agent. Personal copies. I kept them because something felt off. The agent set down his pen. You have copies of the requisition records going back how far? About 10 months. Why didn't you submit them through the reporting system? Holloway looked at his hands for a moment. The first time I tried, the form disappeared. The second time, I got a call from Captain Briggs' assistant telling me there'd been a system error and I should resubmit. I started keeping copies after that because... He paused. I don't know. It just felt like something I should be able to prove. The agent picked his pen back up. Mr. Holloway, I'm going to need those copies. By noon, the secondary investigation, the one that had started as a supply irregularity sidebar and was rapidly becoming something considerably larger, had its own folder on Tollin's table. Bob, Emily ate lunch in the staff cafeteria, which was a choice rather than a necessity. She could have found somewhere quieter. She chose the cafeteria because the staff was anxious and visible anxiety had a way of feeding on isolation, and she'd rather be present in a space where people could see that she was operating normally. She sat with Darren Ash, the young medic she'd worked with the previous afternoon, and a contracted lab tech named Pita Faleolo, who she'd spoken with maybe twice before. Neither of them asked her directly about the investigation. Darren talked about his wound packing training. Pita complained about a centrifuge that had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. Emily listened, contributed where it made sense, ate her food. It was not performed calm. It was just what she actually was. Darren left first to get back to his assignment. Pita lingered over coffee. She was in her early 30s, sharp, with the look of someone running calculations about whether she was going to say the thing she was thinking. She said it. You're the reason they're here, Pita said. Not accusatory, just direct. Emily looked at her. You don't have to tell me details, Pita added. I've been here 2 years. I've watched a lot of people leave. I've watched a lot of stuff not get fixed. And then you show up, you're here 6 months, and now... She gestured vaguely at the window. All of that is outside. Emily wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The same gesture she'd used this morning with Moss, she noticed. Habit. How long did you know something was wrong? Emily asked. Peeta didn't hesitate. From about month 3. Why didn't you file? The look on Peeta's face was complicated, tired and a little ashamed and also a little angry. Same reason most people don't. I watched what happened to the people who did. Emily nodded. I know. Is it going to matter? What's happening today? Is it actually going to change things, or is it just going to be... Peeta stopped. Started again. I've seen investigations before. On other posts. They come in, they document everything, and then the guy gets a letter of reprimand and transfers somewhere else and does the same thing. Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought about the folder Tolland had. She thought about the cross-reference files that were being pulled right now from previous installations. She thought about the 47 seconds of security footage that required no interpretation. This one's different, she said. Peeta studied her. How do you know? Because of how far back it goes. Emily stood, gathered her tray. Go give your statement. Tell them everything, including the centrifuge. Peeta frowned. The centrifuge is a maintenance issue, not... Tell them everything, Emily said again. Let them decide what's relevant. She left Peeta sitting with her coffee and went back to work. At 1340, Colonel Adrian Moss called Emily into the converted conference room again. This time, Major Tolland was there as well, which changed the geometry of the room slightly. Not adversarial, but more formal. A third chair had been added. Emily sat. I want to walk through the full evaluation scope, Tolland said. Not the incident specifically. I have what I need on that. The evaluation itself. What you found, when you found it, how it was documented. Emily talked for 40 minutes. She'd been thorough. The evaluation methodology required it, and her documentation was organized the way things were organized when you knew someone else was going to have to navigate it later. She described the complaint log analysis, the transfer rate patterns, the medication log irregularities that had been her documented pretext for this week's escalation. She described the requisition anomalies she'd flagged in her internal reports, which Tolland confirmed matched what Holloway had just provided. She described the overall command culture in terms that were specific and non-dramatic, a pattern of authority being used to suppress accountability rather than maintain discipline. The distinction mattered. You were under this command for 6 months, Tolland said at one point. You personally experienced the suppression dynamics you were documenting. Yes. That's not standard for an evaluator. No, Emily agreed. It's not ideal. Does it compromise the documentation? Emily thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. I was careful. I didn't file a personal complaint through channels I was also evaluating. The alert I submitted yesterday was through an external channel specifically to avoid that conflict. But, she paused. Someone could raise the question. It's worth noting in the record. Tolland made a note. The physical incident. Do you need to add that to a personal report, separate from the evaluation? Yes, I'll write it this evening. You should have medical documentation of the injury. It's minor. Emily. Moss, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, said her name with a particular weight. Document it. Emily nodded. Tolland closed her notebook, then opened it again. One more thing. Briggs's history. The previous installations. She set the preliminary cross-reference on the table. Emily looked at it. She'd seen some of this, but not all. Her evaluation mandate had been Silver Creek only. How does this change your assessment? Tolland asked. Emily read the sheet in silence. 7 years. 3 installations. The same pattern, repeated, accumulating. A different class of people below him at each post, different ranks, different specialties, but the same mechanics. It doesn't change my assessment of this installation, she said finally, but it changes what needs to happen next. Meaning this is a systemic problem that predates Silver Creek and will outlast it if the response is confined to this installation. Tolland looked at her for a long moment. Colonel Moss tells me your evaluation was scheduled to run 2 more weeks. Correct. Your assessment is that the documentation is complete enough to proceed? My assessment, Emily said carefully, is that the documentation is complete enough to proceed on Briggs and on Hartwell. The broader supply irregularity question may need additional work. We have an agent pulling that thread. Good. Tallinn nodded slowly. Outside, someone was moving equipment through the corridor. The sound of wheels on institutional tile, voices low. I'm going to need your formal testimony as both the evaluator and the personal complainant. That's two separate statements, two separate processes. I understand. It's going to be a long afternoon. Emily looked at the window. Outside, the base was still locked. The Blackhawks were still on the eastern pad. The investigation was still expanding, thread by thread, into something considerably larger than a single captain in a supply room. I cleared my schedule, she said. Captain Nathan Briggs, in the room they'd put him in while he waited for the legal counsel he'd requested, was doing the thing people do when they're alone and scared but can't admit they're scared. He was going over his own story, looking for the version of it that held together. The camera in the supply room was the problem. He kept coming back to it. He'd been the one who'd approved the medication security upgrade. He'd been in the meeting where the camera placements were discussed. He knew the East Corridor had one. He'd just forgotten, in the moment, to factor it into the calculation. That word kept presenting itself. Calculation. As if he'd been calculating all along rather than simply doing what he'd always done, which was maintaining order, which was what command required. He told himself this, but the words stayed there. He thought about the previous installations, about the sergeant at Fort Bellamy who'd filed a complaint that had been resolved, about the contracted nurse at Riverside Post who'd requested reassignment and gotten it, about the records that existed in systems he hadn't thought about in years and was now sitting in this room thinking about very hard. Nobody had connected it before. There'd been no reason to connect it. But that was before the Blackhawks landed, before the federal suits with the lanyards, before Major Tallinn sat across from him with a folder and told him, in a voice that carried the specific gravity of someone who already knew the answer, that they had footage. His legal counsel was supposed to arrive by 1500. It was currently 1412. He had 48 minutes to sit with the particular silence of a story that was no longer going the way he'd written it. He was still sitting there when, at 1423, the door opened and Tallinn came in with a second agent he hadn't seen before, and this time she set two folders on the table instead of one. The second folder was thicker than the first. She sat down, looked at him without expression, and said, "Your counsel isn't here yet, so I'm not going to ask you any questions. But I want you to know that while you've been waiting, my team has been speaking with personnel from Fort Bellamy and Riverside Post." She tapped the second folder. "I wanted you to have that information before we proceed." She stood, took both folders, and left. Briggs stared at the closed door. The 47 seconds of footage from the East Corridor supply room suddenly seemed like the least of his problems. 2 hallways away, Emily Carter was writing her formal personal statement in the careful, specific language of someone who had learned a long time ago that the truth was most powerful when it didn't need decoration. She wrote what happened. She wrote when. She wrote who was present and what they did and what she did and what was said. She wrote it without adjectives where adjectives could be avoided, without editorial comment, without the kind of language that could be argued with. She was on the 3rd page when her phone buzzed. A message from Moss, brief. "Tallinn is expanding. Riverside and Bellamy both opening files tonight." Emily read it, set the phone face down, kept writing. Outside the window, the sun had moved west enough to throw long shadows across the eastern landing pad. And in that changing light, the 2 Blackhawks looked less like authority arriving and more like something that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to become visible. The door opened. Moss leaned in. "There's something you need to see," she said. Her voice had a particular quality that Emily hadn't heard from her in 2 years. Not alarm, but the contained alertness that preceded alarm. Tallinn's team found something in the requisition records. Emily looked up from her statement. "Holloway's copies," Moss said. "There's a signature on 12 of the irregulars. It's not Briggs." Emily set down her pen. "Whose is it?" Moss looked at her steadily. "That's the problem. It's flagged to a clearance level that doesn't match anyone currently assigned to this installation." She paused. "It doesn't match anyone we've identified yet at all." The room was very quiet. Emily stood up. The requisition records were spread across the conference table in 2 rows. Holloway's copies stacked against the printed versions Tolland's team had pulled from the base system. At first glance, they looked identical. That was the point. They were supposed to look identical. The kind of thing that passed inspection at the local level because local-level inspection wasn't designed to catch it. The discrepancy was in the authorization chain. 12 requisitions over a 10-month period, all within normal supply ranges for a medical installation this size, all correctly coded, all carrying a secondary approval signature beneath the primary. The secondary signature was the problem. It existed in the base system. It did not exist in Holloway's physical copies, which he'd printed directly from the same system 8 to 10 months ago. Someone had added it retroactively. "Show me the access log for these records," Emily said. Tolland's technical agent, a young specialist named Carver, who had the slightly hollow look of someone who'd been staring at database records for 6 straight hours, pulled up the screen. The system log shows the secondary signature was added to all 12 records over a 3-week window, 6 months ago, after Holloway made his copies. By about 2 months, yeah. Emily studied the screen. The clearance code attached to the secondary signature was real. It existed in the DoD personnel database. It had an active status flag. It was tied to a medical procurement specialist designation. What it wasn't tied to was any name currently on Silver Creek's posted roster, visitor log, or contractor manifest. "The code is real," Carver said, "but it's assigned to a ghost account. Someone created a personnel entry in the procurement system and attached a legitimate clearance tier to it. If you're not looking at the originating account specifically, it reads as a valid authorization." Moss had moved to stand behind Carver's chair, reading over his shoulder. "How hard is it to create an account like that?" "You'd need access to the procurement database at the regional command level minimum. It's not something you do from a base terminal." He paused. "Or it's not something you're supposed to be able to do from a base terminal." The room's air felt different than it had 20 minutes ago. Tolland was standing at the end of the table with her arms crossed, looking at the requisition printouts with the expression of someone revising a calculation. She'd come into this morning expecting a straightforward assault investigation with a personnel misconduct sidebar. The sidebar had grown a second floor. "Briggs doesn't have the access level for this," Emily said. "No," Tolland confirmed. "Hartwell does." "Hartwell has the access. Whether he has the technical capability is a different question." Tolland looked at Carver. "Can you trace the originating IP for the account creation?" "Already running it. It's going to take time. Whoever did this routed it through at least 2 intermediate nodes." "How much time?" Carver considered. "If I'm lucky, a few hours. If they were careful, overnight." Tolland nodded. "Then we work with what we have now." She looked at Emily. "The assault documentation, the complaint suppression, the transfer pattern, that moves forward regardless of where this goes. I don't want the supply irregularity question slowing down what's already solid." "Agreed," Emily said. "But this—" Tolland tapped the requisition printouts. "This doesn't feel like Briggs." "No," Emily said. "It doesn't." She was looking at the window when she said it, not at the records. Outside, the light was getting long. The base was still locked, still holding the particular breath of a place that knew something was happening but didn't yet know how large. The supply irregularities weren't enormous in dollar terms. That was the thing. 12 requisitions over 10 months, quantities slightly above census-supported need, routed to a distribution account that had no physical delivery address attached. Not enough to be a red flag in standard audit. Not enough to draw attention at the regional level without a specific reason to look. The kind of thing designed to be invisible. The question wasn't how much. The question was where it went. And the question under that was, who else knew? Colonel Victor Hartwell had spent 31 years learning how to read situations the way other people read weather. Not with certainty, but with the accumulated pattern recognition of someone who'd been wrong enough times to get calibrated. He could read this one clearly enough. The investigation had expanded. The helicopters on the East Pad were not going back to wherever they'd come from today. He was in his office, which technically he was still allowed to occupy. He hadn't been formally relieved yet, which Tolland had told him was a matter of procedural sequence rather than assessment. And he was looking at his desk with the specific stillness of a man who understood that anything he reached for right now would be observed and recorded and used. He didn't reach for anything. His legal counsel had arrived at 1430, a JAG officer named Major Freitas, who had the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen worse. Freitas had advised him, concisely, to say nothing further until they'd had time to review what the investigators actually had. Hartwell had nodded. He was good at nodding. 31 years. The thing about Hartwell was that he hadn't intended for any of this. He was aware this was not a legal argument, but it was true, in the way that truths that don't help you are still true. He'd looked the other way on Briggs because Briggs ran a tight administrative operation, and the complaint volume, while persistent, had never produced anything that couldn't be characterized as personnel friction. Every installation had friction. You managed it, you resolved it on paper, you kept the numbers moving. He'd looked the other way because looking required a certain kind of energy he'd been rationing for years, and because nothing had ever blown up. Until now. He thought about the requisition records and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He hadn't touched those records. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. In this room where nobody was watching, he wanted to be clear. He hadn't created a ghost account. He hadn't added retroactive signatures. He had the access level, technically, but the requisition irregularities were not his. The problem was that something had been running through his command, under his clearance tier, and he hadn't seen it, or hadn't looked for it. The distinction felt important from where he was sitting, though he understood it might not look that way from the outside. Freitas had told him to say nothing. He was very good at saying nothing. He'd been doing it for 14 months. He sat at his desk and looked at the wall and thought about all the things he hadn't said anything about, and the weight of them had never felt quite so specific. Tollin's team found the IP trace at 1847. Carver had gotten lucky, not in the sense of skill, though he was skilled, but in the sense that the person who'd routed the account creation through intermediate nodes had been careful about 2 of them and careless about a third. The third node was a regional medical logistics terminal that kept its own access logs in a separate system, and that system wasn't sophisticated enough to have been scrubbed. The originating access came from a terminal registered to the Regional Medical Procurement Office. Not Silver Creek. Not this installation at all. Elliston Regional Command, Carver said, reading off the screen. Their medical logistics division, specifically. The account was created from a terminal in their building. Tollin looked at the result for a long moment. That's a different installation entirely. Yes, ma'am. Who has access to that terminal? I've got a list. 14 people with standard access, plus 3 with elevated clearance. She took the list. Read it once, quickly. Flag everyone with procurement authority and cross-reference with the Silver Creek vendor account the irregulars were routed to. Carver typed. Running it now. The cross-reference took 4 minutes. When it came back, 2 names had hits. One was a retired contractor whose system access should have been deactivated 18 months ago and hadn't been an administrative failure common enough, probably not relevant. The other was a name that appeared on both the Elliston Terminal Access List and on Silver Creek's vendor account creation record from 16 months ago, before Emily had arrived. The name was Major Dennis Farrow, assigned to Elliston Regional Command's Medical Logistics Division, not currently on Silver Creek's roster, not listed on any visitor log for the past year. Tollin took the printout to Emily. Emily read it without speaking. She turned the page, read the access record dates, cross-referenced them in her head against the timeline she'd built over 6 months. I don't know him, she said. Neither do we yet. Tollin sat across from her. But his access record shows 6 remote logins to Silver Creek's procurement system over the past 10 months, all outside normal duty hours. Remote logins are logged? They're supposed to be. These were logged but not flagged because the clearance level matched and the access duration was short, under the automatic review threshold each time. Tollin paused. Whoever set this up understood the automated audit parameters. Emily put the printout down. She thought about the requisition amounts, modest, distributed, designed to be invisible. She thought about the ghost account, The retroactive signatures, the routing to a vendor account with no delivery address. None of this was improvised. Someone had built it carefully, over time, with knowledge of how the system's automated oversight worked. This started before Briggs got here, Emily said. Tallon nodded slowly. The first irregular requisition is dated 19 months ago. Briggs arrived 14 months ago. So Briggs may not have known about this at all. Or he found out and looked the other way for the same reason Hartwell looked the other way, on his complaint history. Emily thought about that. Or he was used as cover, a loud, aggressive administrator who generated exactly the kind of personnel turbulence that keeps investigators focused on conduct issues rather than financial ones. The room was quiet for a moment. Tallon was looking at her with the expression of someone filing something away. "You think Briggs was a distraction," Tallon said. "I think it's worth considering." "From what? We don't know yet what the requisitions were actually funding." "No," Emily said, "but Elliston Regional Command's Medical Logistics Division would." Tallon picked up her phone. The formal testimony sessions ran until 2100. Emily gave her personal statement first, the assault, the specific language used, the sequence of events in the supply room, in front of a court reporter and Tallon and an Army JAG officer who was there to ensure the record was clean. She answered every question with the same precision she'd applied to her evaluation documentation. When Tallon asked how she'd felt after the incident, Emily thought about it honestly. "Angry," she said. "Briefly. Then I had patients to see." The JAG officer made a note. After the personal statement came the formal evaluation testimony, which was longer and required the structured presentation of 14 months of documentation in a format that would withstand legal scrutiny. Emily had organized her files for exactly this. Every observation dated, every data point sourced, every conclusion qualified at the appropriate confidence level. It wasn't exciting material. It was the kind of thorough, unglamorous documentation that investigations ran on. At one point, Tallon asked her to describe the command culture at Silver Creek in a single characterization. Emily was quiet for a moment. An institution where the cost of speaking was higher than the benefit of being heard. Tallon wrote that down verbatim. The witness interviews were still running in parallel. Agents cycling through staff members who'd been waiting in assigned areas all day, collecting accounts that were consistent with each other in the ways that true accounts were consistent, which was imperfectly. People remembered different details, sequenced things slightly differently, emphasized different elements. The investigators knew what to do with this. Fabricated stories had artificial consistency. True ones had the texture of individual perception. Yolanda Pruitt was interviewed a second time, briefly, to clarify a detail about a scheduling incident from September. She provided it without hesitation. She'd been holding it for months, and now that she'd started talking, it came out in the order it had actually happened, which made it easy to follow. Marcus Webb gave a supplemental statement about the supply room incident that added one detail he'd initially omitted. He'd heard Briggs's voice from the corridor before the sound of impact, and the tone had been the particular controlled anger tone he'd heard from Briggs before, in smaller incidents that he hadn't documented because, as he told Ramos with the slightly ashamed directness of someone who'd done the math on his own choices, he hadn't wanted to become a target. "I should have filed something months ago," Webb said. Ramos wrote it down without comment. He'd heard that phrase 11 times today. He expected to hear it again. Bussin. At 21:34, Carver came to find Tallon in the corridor outside the conference room with a look on his face that Emily, standing nearby, read immediately as the look of someone who'd found the thing they'd been looking for and wasn't sure they wanted to have found it. "The vendor account," he said, "the one the irregular requisitions were routed to. I pulled the actual distribution records." Tallon waited. The supplies weren't going to a phantom address. They were being logged as received by a legitimate medical contractor operating under a DoD support agreement. He held up the printout. Severn Medical Solutions. They're a legitimate company, licensed, contracted, audited, but their receiving records for this material don't match what was requisitioned. Explain. The quantity discrepancy is significant. Silver Creek was requisitioning, say, 200 units of a given supply. Severn's records show receiving 150, 50 units per order, 12 orders. 600 units unaccounted for, Emily said. Across multiple supply categories, yeah. Not all medical consumables. Some of it is equipment. Carver looked at his printout. The unaccounted quantities match a separate set of purchase records I found in Severn's system, a secondary sales ledger that's not part of their standard DoD audit package. The corridor was very still. Where were they being sold? Tolland asked. Carver looked at his printout again, as if confirming something he still found hard to say. Gray market, medical equipment and supplies, sold at below procurement cost to buyers outside the DoD contractor system. The secondary ledger shows transactions going back 22 months. 22 months. 8 months before the first irregular requisition at Silver Creek. Which meant Silver Creek wasn't the only source. How many installations? Emily asked. Carver looked at her. He'd been at this for 8 hours and had the flattened affect of someone running on caffeine and the particular tunnel focus of a problem that kept expanding. We've identified supply flow from at least 3 installations so far. Silver Creek is the most recent. The others, he paused. This is bigger than one base. Tolland had gone very still in the way she went still when she was recalibrating. Emily recognized it from the morning. It was the stillness of someone who'd come in expecting one scale of problem and was now looking at a significantly different one. Major Farrow, Tolland said. His access record touches all 3 installations' procurement systems. Who else? That's what I don't know yet. Farrow's account is the one I can trace directly, but a scheme across 3 installations over almost 2 years, that's not one person working alone. Tolland turned to Emily. She didn't ask a question. She just looked. Emily thought about 19 months of invisible requisitions. She thought about a ghost account created with regional command access. She thought about a loud, aggressive captain who generated maximum personnel friction and minimum financial scrutiny. She thought about an installation commander who'd spent 14 months looking away from complaints filed through his own system. You need to freeze Hartwell's system access tonight, Emily said, before he realizes what Carver found. Tolland was already reaching for her phone. And Farrow's? Yes. And whoever else has regional command procurement access that touches all 3 installations. Emily paused. You need the full access list from Elliston tonight, not tomorrow. I'm aware. Because if Farrow knows you've traced the terminal, Emily. Tolland's voice was flat and focused. I've done this before. Emily stopped. Tolland was right. This was Tolland's domain, not hers. She'd done her job. She'd documented what was here. She'd flagged the discrepancy. She'd been the reason anyone was looking at the requisition records at all. The investigation from this point was a different kind of work. She took a breath, nodded once. Tolland was on the phone, talking fast and quiet, walking away down the corridor. Carver was already back at his terminal. The base around them had the particular exhausted tension of a long institutional day that wasn't finished yet. Moss appeared at Emily's shoulder. You need to eat something. I ate lunch. It's after 9. Emily looked at the window at the end of the corridor. Dark outside now, the eastern landing pad lit by ground lights, the 2 Blackhawks sitting quiet. How many people knew what was in those requisition records and didn't say anything? Moss was quiet for a moment. That's not a question you can answer tonight. I know. Emily turned away from the window. That doesn't stop me from asking it. The corridor was long and institutional and identical to 100 other corridors and 100 other installations, and Emily had walked a version of this corridor in 3 countries before she'd put on a contractor badge and come to Silver Creek. She knew exactly what it felt like to be inside a place that was rotten in the walls, not visibly, not dramatically, just quietly, in the load-bearing structures where rot was hardest to find. She'd found it. The question that was forming now, walking back toward the conference room with Moss beside her, was not whether she'd done her job. She had. The question was what happened when you pulled one thread and found it connected to something that hadn't been on any assessment scope, any authorization document, any brief she'd received before setting foot in this building. She reached the conference room, sat down, looked at the papers still spread across the table. Her formal evaluation of Silver Creek Medical Center, as originally scoped, was complete. Its conclusions were documented and unambiguous, but Carver was still at his terminal, and Tolland was still on the phone. And somewhere in Elliston Regional Command's Medical Logistics Division, a man named Major Dennis Farrow was either going about his evening without any idea that a trace had been run on his access records, or he already knew, the way people in these systems sometimes knew, through channels and signals that moved faster than official notification, and was deciding, right now, what to do about it. Emily stared at the table. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She picked up, static for 1 second, then a voice she didn't recognize, low and deliberate, as if choosing each word with care. "You should stop where you are," the voice said. "What's already happened tonight is enough to end this. If you keep going, it won't just be a base-level problem anymore." The call ended. Emily held the phone in her hand and looked at the door. Emily set the phone face down on the table. Not fast. Deliberately. The same way she'd set the folder down in the supply room yesterday morning, with the specific control of someone who'd learned that the body's first impulse was usually the wrong one. She sat for 3 seconds. Then she picked the phone back up and did 2 things. She screenshotted the call log showing the unknown number and timestamp, and she walked into the corridor to find Tolland. Tolland was still on the phone. She saw Emily's face and wrapped up the call in 30 seconds. Emily showed her the screenshot, told her the exact words, in order, without editorializing. Tolland listened without interrupting. When Emily finished, Tolland looked at the screenshot for a moment, then at Emily. "You recognize the voice?" "No." "Male? Female?" "Male. Mid-range. No strong regional accent. Deliberate pacing. Not nervous." "Not nervous," Tolland repeated. He knew what he wanted to say before he called. Tolland handed the phone to Carver, who had appeared at her shoulder with the reflexive presence of someone who'd learned to materialize when things accelerated. "Trace the originating number. I want carrier records, tower pings, anything within the hour." Carver took the phone and was gone. Tolland turned back to Emily. The corridor was empty enough that they could speak at a normal volume and not be overheard. "The call means one of 2 things. Either someone on this base learned what we found tonight and is trying to slow us down, or someone outside the base already knew we were looking," Emily finished, "which means the information is moving faster than the investigation." "Yes." Tolland was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of someone making a decision that had implications in multiple directions. "I'm going to need you to treat this as a security event. Full log, full documentation. Treat the number as potentially connected to Farrow or whoever Farrow is working with." "I already assumed that." "Don't discuss what we found tonight with anyone outside this room who hasn't already been briefed. Not Moss, not your DoD program supervisor chain, not anyone until I give the clearance." Emily looked at her steadily. "Moss is my chain." "I know. I'll clear it with her. I'm asking for a few hours." It was a reasonable ask. Emily understood why. If the information was moving laterally through channels that connected to the people they were building a case against, then controlling the flow tonight mattered. She nodded. Tolland went back to her phone. Emily went to find Moss. Yeah, Moss took the restriction without argument, which told Emily that Tolland had already reached her. She was sitting in the small office they'd given her at the end of the administrative wing, working through paperwork with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned to use waiting time. She looked up when Emily came in, read her face, and pointed at the chair across the desk. Emily sat. "Tolland told me about the call," Moss said. "Then you know why the scope changed." "The scope changed 3 hours ago when Carver found the secondary ledger." Moss set down her pen. "How are you doing?" Emily considered giving the reflexive answer and didn't. "I'm running on empty, and I have a lot of things I want to do tonight that I've been told to hold off on." "Such as?" "Pulling Farrow's full personnel file, cross-referencing the 3 installation supply timelines against known personnel movements, looking at who transferred between Elliston and Silver Creek in the past 2 years. Moss looked at her. "Tolland's team is doing that." "I know." "Then let them do it." Emily leaned back in the chair. The ceiling was institutional tile, the same in every building like this. "Someone called my personal phone, Adrienne. Not the base system, not my evaluation channel, my personal number." Moss was quiet. That number is not on any document connected to this installation. It's not in the contractor database. It's not. Emily stopped. It's on my DoD program file. Yes, Moss said carefully. It is. The implication settled between them without needing to be made explicit. Emily's DoD program file was not a public document. The people who could access it held senior clearances and were connected to the program Moss supervised. The number of people who could have passed her personal contact information to whoever had called tonight was not large. I'm not accusing anyone in the program, Emily said. I'm saying the access radius is small. I understand what you're saying. Moss's voice was level, but there was something beneath it. Not quite fear, but the particular alertness of someone who'd just had their perimeter expanded unexpectedly. I'll look at the access log for your personnel file tonight. Tolland should know. I'll tell her. Moss picked up her pen again, then set it down. Emily, this is beyond the scope of what the evaluation was designed to handle. I'm aware. That means you're not the primary investigator on the parts that matter most right now. You're a witness and a complainant, and your documentation is critical, but the next phase, that's federal. That's Tolland's team and whoever they bring in from Elliston. I know that. Do you? Emily looked at her supervisor, at the woman who'd recruited her into the program 3 years ago, who'd read her service record and decided that what she was had value beyond what most institutions could see or use. She thought about saying something that would end the conversation efficiently. She chose honesty instead. I'm struggling to let go of it, she said, because I've been building this picture for 6 months and I can see the whole shape of it, and Tolland's team is smart, but they've been here 12 hours and I've been here 6 months and... She stopped. I know that's exactly the problem with being the person who knows the most. You think you need to be the one who finishes it. Moss looked at her for a long moment. You found it, you documented it, you got it into the right hands. That's the job. Emily nodded. It was true. It didn't fully help, but it was true. She went back to her quarters at 22:30 and lay on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling until the exhaustion pulled her under. The morning came gray and cold, the kind of early spring morning that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. Emily was up at 05:30, showered and in clean clothes by 0600, and in the cafeteria getting bad coffee before most of the base had processed that a second day of lockdown was in effect. The lockdown extension had been communicated through the same terse administrative message as the first: installation personnel to remain on site pending ongoing administrative review. No departure authorization until further notice. At 06:45, Tolland found her. She sat down across from Emily with a cup of coffee she didn't appear to be drinking and a folder she set on the table between them. She looked like someone who'd slept 3 hours and made them count. Carrier records came back on the number, she said. Prepaid. Purchased in cash at a convenience store outside Elliston 11 days ago. 11 days ago. Before the assault, before yesterday. Someone anticipated this, Emily said. Someone planned for the possibility of needing to make a call like that, yes. Tolland opened the folder. Farrow's access to Silver Creek's procurement system was suspended at 2200 last night. Elliston was notified through a channel that doesn't route through their medical logistics division. We went directly to their installation command. Did Farrow know before the suspension? Unknown. He was not on site at Elliston when the suspension was processed. Off-duty hours, so that's not unusual. But you don't know where he was. We know where his government vehicle was. Base residential area. Whether he was in it is a different question. Tolland turned a page. The secondary ledger from Severn Medical Solutions. Our forensic accounting team worked through the night. The gray market sales connect to buyers in 4 states. The total value of diverted supplies over 22 months is approximately $900,000. Emily absorbed that. $900,000 distributed across enough transactions to stay invisible at the individual supply category level. It was sophisticated in its modesty, the kind of scheme designed not to become conspicuous, just to run. The other 2 installations, she said. Which ones? Darnell Medical Post in Georgia and Hampton Base in Virginia. Both medical installations. Both with procurement systems that have the same regional command architecture as Silver Creek, All three fall under Elliston's Regional Oversight Authority, which is where Farrow works. Which is where Farrow works. Tollin paused. His personnel file is interesting. 14 years in medical logistics, consistent performance reviews, no complaint history, the kind of record that reads as unremarkable unless you're looking for something specific. He didn't generate friction, Emily said. He didn't do what Briggs did. He stayed quiet and useful and didn't give anyone a reason to look at him. No, he did not. Tollin turned another page. But there's a gap in his financial records that our forensic team flagged. His documented income over the past 22 months is consistent with his military salary. His actual spending pattern is not. Emily waited. Property purchase in Montana, cash transaction, owner-financed arrangement that doesn't require traditional mortgage documentation, vehicle registered to a family member, 2 international transfers routed through a third-party account. Tollin looked up from the folder. He wasn't keeping the money in a place that should have been obvious, but he was spending it in ways that left traces if you knew to look. Does he know you're looking? As of last night, possibly. As of this morning, Tollin's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Something shifted in her expression. Not alarm, but the rapid reassessment of someone who'd just received information that changed the sequence. Farrow didn't report to his duty station this morning. The cafeteria had filled up around them while they'd been talking. Staff moving through the line. The ordinary sounds of a base meal in progress. Emily registered it the same way she registered the patient sounds in the ward. Background data. Continuous monitoring. He's running, she said. Or he's late. Tollin was already on the phone. But we're treating it as the former. She stood, stepped away from the table, her voice dropping into the quick, flat efficiency of someone giving instructions under time pressure. Emily sat with her coffee. She thought about the voice on the phone last night. The deliberate pacing, the words chosen in advance. What's already happened tonight is enough to end this. If you keep going, it won't just be a base-level problem anymore. The statement had been designed to sound like a warning. What it actually was, she understood now, was a measurement. Whoever had made that call was assessing whether she was the kind of person who stopped. The answer was documented in 47 seconds of security footage and 6 months of evaluation records. She was not. What? By 900, the nature of the investigation had formally shifted. Tollin's team was joined by 2 additional federal agents from the DoD Inspector General's office, both of whom had flown in overnight, which meant the request had gone up and come back down fast, which meant someone above Tollin had looked at the secondary ledger and the 3 installation pattern and decided this was a different category of problem than a personnel misconduct case at a single base. Emily was officially rebriefed on her status at 0930. She was no longer primarily an evaluation witness. She was a cooperating source in an active federal fraud and procurement investigation, which meant her documentation, her testimony, and her access to the investigation were now governed by a different set of protocols. Tollin walked her through it efficiently. You'll be interviewed formally by the IG team this morning. Everything you've already documented stays in the record. The evaluation conclusions are being formally submitted to the DoD program office as of today. That process moves forward regardless of what happens with the broader investigation. Hartwell, Emily said, and Briggs. Both remain in restricted status on base. Briggs's legal counsel requested a meeting this morning. We haven't granted it yet. Why not? Because we want to see if the delay produces additional information. Tollin said it flatly, without apology. Briggs has been in a room by himself for about 17 hours. Sometimes that produces decisions. You think he knows more about the supply irregularities than his access level suggests? I think he's been at this installation for 14 months, and he's good at paying attention to things he can use. Whether he acted on that knowledge is a different question. Emily thought about Briggs in the supply room, the specific confidence of someone who'd done this before, and expected the same outcome. That confidence wasn't only about the assault. It was about a larger sense of institutional immunity, the belief that his position protected him from consequences. He thought this was a complaint he could manage, she said. He didn't know what I actually was, but he'd managed complaints before, and he expected this to go the same way. Yes. which means someone let him develop that expectation. His history at previous installations, every complaint that got resolved or buried, that's not Hartwell covering for him at those other posts. That's a pattern across different commands. We know, Tallinn said. That investigation is now coordinated with the previous installations. Fort Bellamy and Riverside Post both have open files as of this morning. Emily nodded. It was the right response. It was also deeply unsatisfying in the way that right responses often were. The right thing happening on a timeline that didn't match the urgency of what had been wrong. The IG team interview ran from 10:00 to 12:30. Emily had done formal testimony before, in context she didn't discuss in civilian settings, and she understood the structure. You answered what was asked, you qualified what needed qualification, you didn't editorialize and you didn't summarize for them. You gave them the material and you trusted them to build with it. The lead agent was named Vasquez, a compact woman in her 40s who asked questions with a surgical brevity that Emily respected. She didn't repeat questions. She didn't ask the same thing in two different framings to see if she'd get a different answer. She trusted her own hearing. At one point, Vasquez asked about the phone call. Emily described it again, verbatim. The phrase, "it won't just be a base-level problem," Vasquez said. How did you interpret that? As a statement of scope. Whoever called was communicating that the network was larger than what we'd found, either to intimidate me or to negotiate a stopping point. Which do you think it was? Emily thought about it honestly. Both. The intimidation was the vehicle. The negotiation was the actual message. She paused. They wanted me to decide what we'd found was enough. That was the offer. And if you'd taken it? The supply scheme continues. Pharaoh stays invisible. Briggs gets disciplined for the assault at the individual level, and the systemic problems get characterized as isolated personnel issues. She looked at Vasquez steadily. That's the version of this story where nothing changes. Vasquez made a note and moved to the next question. Ochas. At 13:47, Briggs made his decision. His legal counsel had been granted access at noon, after 17 hours of waiting that had apparently produced exactly what Tallinn had expected. Briggs had sat in his room with no phone, no outside contact, no information about what the investigation had developed, and done what people in that situation generally did. He'd done the math. He came into the formal interview room at 13:47 with his counsel and the particular expression of someone who had been through something and had not come out the other side looking better for it. The confidence from yesterday, the flat certainty of someone who'd been in authority long enough to forget what accountability felt like, was gone. In its place was something more ordinary and therefore somehow worse, a man who was scared and was trying not to show that he was skishrimmed and wasn't quite managing it. He sat down. His counsel set a single sheet of paper on the table. Captain Briggs would like to provide additional information, the counsel said, in exchange for consideration of his cooperation in the broader investigation. Tallinn looked at the sheet. She didn't pick it up. We'll hear the information. Consideration is contingent on its value and accuracy. Briggs looked at his counsel. His counsel nodded. Briggs looked at the table. I knew about the requisitions. He said it flat, without preamble, apparently having decided that the version with build-up would be harder. Not the full scope of it. I didn't know about Pharaoh specifically, but about 8 months after I arrived here, I found a discrepancy in our supply count that didn't match the order logs. I reported it to Hartwell. Tallinn was very still. What was Hartwell's response? He told me the discrepancy was a logistics accounting issue that was being handled at the regional level. He told me not to document it further. Briggs's jaw tightened. He told me that if I kept my administrative operation running clean, it wouldn't be my problem. And you accepted that. I had a choice between accepting it and not accepting it. He stopped. Started again. I've seen what happens to people who push up against something that's already protected from above. I've been in the Army 22 years. I know what protected looks like. So you decided to look away. I decided to stay in my lane, Briggs said, which I know is the same thing. There was a silence in the room. Tallinn let it run. And the complaints, she said eventually, the personnel complaints that came through your office, the ones that were resolved without resolution. Briggs looked at the table. That was mine. That wasn't connected to the supply thing. That was... He stopped. I run a tight operation. I don't like friction. I've always handled complaints at the unit level. By ensuring they went away. By managing them. Yes. He said it without the qualifier he'd started to add. A small piece of honesty, probably the first one in a long time, landing in the room with the weight of something that had been held for years. The woman who transferred from Riverside Post, Tolland said. 18 months ago. Briggs was quiet. The PA at Fort Bellamy, who requested emergency reassignment, still quiet. There are 7 names across 3 installations, Captain. I'm going to need you to walk me through each of them. He walked her through each of them. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. His counsel interjected twice. Briggs talked over him once, which his counsel noted for the record without visible surprise. By the end of it, the picture was specific and unambiguous. A pattern across 3 installations, 7 people whose complaints had been managed rather than addressed, whose departures had been processed rather than investigated. Not coordinated, not conspiratorial, just the same response, repeated across different people in different places, because the response had always worked. Until now. Farrow's government vehicle was found at 1520, parked in a long-term lot near the regional airport 40 minutes from Elliston. The vehicle itself was unoccupied and locked. His personal phone was found in the center console, which told Tolland's team that he'd switched to something else, either the prepaid that had been used to call Emily or another device they hadn't identified yet. The airport's departure records were pulled. No flight under Farrow's name or any of the 3 aliases his financial records had flagged. But the long-term lot wasn't the departure terminal. It was the economy lot that connected to the rental car center. The rental car center's record showed a vehicle signed out under a name that matched one of the financial aliases at 0712 that morning. 4-hour lead on the investigation. Tolland put out a notification through federal channels at 1534. The rental vehicle's plate went into the system. 2 state police agencies were notified. The notification was careful, wanted for questioning in connection with a federal investigation, not an arrest warrant yet, because the formal charges hadn't been filed and Tolland wasn't going to overreach and give a defense attorney something to work with. She briefed Emily on Farrow's status at 1600. He's in the wind, Emily said. For now. Tolland didn't look particularly alarmed, which Emily had learned over the past 36 hours was her baseline. People who run make mistakes. He's got resources and he had a head start, but he's not a professional fugitive. He knows procurement systems. He doesn't know how to disappear. How long? Days, not weeks. Maybe faster. Tolland paused. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly rather than helpfully. Emily looked at her. The call last night. Is there any part of you that considered it? Stopping where we were, letting the Briggs assault move forward as a standalone case, letting the supply investigation stay limited to what was already documented? Emily thought about it the way Tolland had asked. Honestly, not helpfully. For about 3 seconds. What ended it? I thought about Yolanda Pruitt saying she should have spoken up months ago. I thought about Marcus Webb saying the same thing. I thought about the nurse who cried in the locker room the day before she transferred. She looked at Tolland steadily. And I thought about the fact that if I stopped, whoever called me would know exactly where my line was. That's information I don't want them to have. Tolland nodded slowly. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite warmth, but something adjacent to respect. The evaluation conclusions are being formally filed tonight. Your personal complaint is a separate document in the case record. What Briggs did in that supply room is not lost in the larger investigation. It's a documented federal charge on its own track. I know. I want you to know that it's not going to be minimized because the supply case is bigger. Emily was quiet for a moment. I'm less concerned about what happens to Briggs than I am about the 7 people from the previous installations who filed complaints that never went anywhere. Those files are being reopened, all 7. Good. Tolland stood. The formal press inquiry for the installation lockdown is going to come through in the next 24 hours. We'll have a public affairs statement ready. Nothing specific, but the lockdown will stop being explainable as administrative review. What will you say? That an ongoing federal investigation is being conducted. Standard language. She paused at the door. Your name won't be in the statement. I know. But Briggs will eventually be. And Hartwell's. Emily nodded. What do you need for tonight? Tolland asked. It was a practical question, not a kind one. Resources, access, information. She meant, what do you need to keep functioning? Sleep, Emily said, and whatever Carver finds on the full network when he gets it. You'll have both. She almost made it out the door before Emily said, Tolland. Tolland looked back. Thank you for not treating the call as a reason to limit my access. Tolland's expression didn't change much, but something around her eyes did. You flagged it immediately. You documented it. You didn't try to handle it yourself. A beat. That's what made it easy. She left. Emily turned back to the table, to the papers that had been accumulating for 2 days, to the documentation that had started as a medication log discrepancy and had grown into something she hadn't fully anticipated when she'd filed the first form. She thought about what Tolland had said. People who run make mistakes. She thought about the voice on the phone, deliberate and prepared, measuring her response. She thought about Pharaoh's vehicle in the long-term lot, his phone in the console, left behind because keeping it was a risk, abandoned because vanishing was more important than the appearance of normalcy. She thought about the shape of a network designed to be invisible. 3 installations, a regional command position, a gray market operation running under the cover of institutional noise, personnel friction here, complaint management there, the ordinary chaos of a large medical command providing the perfect environment for something quieter and more deliberate to run underneath. Briggs had generated the noise. Whether he'd done it intentionally or simply because that was who he was, that was still an open question. But it had worked. For 14 months at this installation, it had worked. Her phone buzzed. Carver. Full network map is coming together. You need to see this before the morning briefing. There's a name in the financial transfers you're going to recognize. Emily stared at the message. She typed back, Who? The reply took 40 seconds, which for Carver, who typed fast, was a long time. Colonel Adrienne Moss. 2 transfers 14 months ago, before Carter arrived at Silver Creek. Small amounts. But they're there. Emily set the phone down on the table. She looked at the door. She looked at the phone. She picked it up and called Tolland. Tolland picked up on the second ring. Emily didn't build to it. Carver sent me something. Financial transfers connecting to Moss. 2 transactions, 14 months ago. You need to verify it before morning. Silence on the line. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of someone who'd been running a complex investigation and had just been handed a piece that changed the load-bearing structure. Where are you? Tolland asked. Conference room. Stay there. She came in 4 minutes later with Carver behind her, his laptop open and already running. He set it on the table without preamble and turned the screen toward Emily. 2 wire transfers, both originating from the same intermediate account that had processed several of Pharaoh's gray market payments. Destination: a personal savings account registered to Adrienne L. Moss, Colonel, U.S. Army, DoD Medical Review Program. The amounts were not large. $11,000 and $9,000, transferred 14 months ago within a 3-week window. Small enough to stay under standard automated flagging thresholds. Large enough to matter. Emily studied the screen for a long time without speaking. These could be explained, she said finally. They could, Tolland agreed, and they will be, one way or another, through a formal financial review process that starts tonight. She paused. But I need to ask you directly. Does this change anything about your evaluation documentation? Anything Moss directed you toward or away from? Emily thought about 6 months of work. She thought about every conversation with Moss, every formal check-in, every piece of guidance she'd received. She thought about the moment Moss had told her to document the injury, the moment she'd said, "Let them do it," about the parallel investigation threads, the moment tonight when she'd said, "I'll tell her about the access log for Emily's personnel file." She thought about the phone call, the personal number, the access radius she'd described to Moss as small. "No," Emily said. "The evaluation documentation is mine. She didn't direct any of it. She looked at Tolland. But she knew I was here. She knew my cover. She had access to my personal contact information. Yes. If she passed any of that to Pharaoh, that's what the financial review will determine. Tolland's voice was careful. Not cold, but contained. Right now, these are transfers that require explanation. They're not a conviction. Emily nodded. She understood the distinction, and she respected it, and it didn't make the next question any easier. What do I do tonight? She asked. You don't contact Moss. You don't acknowledge receiving Carver's message. You go to your quarters, you sleep if you can, and you let us work the financial thread. Tolland looked at her with the directness of someone who understood they were asking something difficult. Can you do that? Emily thought about Adrienne Moss, who had recruited her into this program, who had looked at her service record and seen something worth using, who had 14 months ago received $20,000 from an account connected to the man currently driving a rental car under an assumed name toward an unknown destination. Yes, Emily said. She meant it. She went back to her quarters. She did not sleep. Moss was placed under administrative hold at 04:45 the following morning. Before the base woke, and before she had reason to check the access log she'd told Emily she would pull. 2 agents from the IG team went to the quarters she'd been assigned on base, knocked, identified themselves, and explained that she was being asked to surrender her devices and remain available for questioning. Moss asked one question. Is this about the transfers? The agents noted that she'd asked the question rather than the expected variance. What transfers? What is this about? I need my counsel. The agents noted it in their report without editorializing. The report would later speak for itself. Emily found out at 06:30 when Tolland came to the cafeteria where she was on her second bad coffee and told her simply, clearly, without softening it. Emily sat with it for a moment. Did she know about the supply scheme when she assigned me here? Emily asked. We don't have a full picture yet. The financial review is going to take time. Tolland sat down across from her. What we know now is that the transfers predate your assignment to Silver Creek by 2 months. The timeline puts them at the point when the DoD Medical Review Program was selecting evaluation targets. Silver Creek was on the candidate list. She assigned me to an installation where she had a financial connection to the procurement fraud. Yes. Which means either she wanted the investigation to find it, Emily stopped, or she wanted someone she trusted inside the installation while the scheme was running. Tolland said it without inflection, because the inflection would have been too much. We don't know which yet, maybe both. People's motivations in these situations are rarely clean. Emily looked at her coffee. She thought about what it meant to be trusted by someone and to not know what that trust was built on. She thought about the 6 months she'd spent believing she was working for a program that had sent her somewhere because the evidence warranted scrutiny. And she'd been right. The evidence had warranted scrutiny. It was possible Moss had banked on exactly that. It was possible Moss had sent the person most likely to find the thing that needed finding, as a way of creating the documentation that would let her claim clean hands at the end. Or it was simpler and worse. Moss had taken money, convinced herself it was small enough not to matter, and made an assignment based on factors that had nothing to do with the money, and the two facts sat in proximity without being connected by intent. People were not clean. Emily knew this. She'd spent enough time in enough institutions to know that the corruption that was hardest to prosecute was the kind that didn't come from malice, but from the accumulation of small compromises, each one individually defensible. Does it change the investigation? Emily asked. The evaluation documentation stands on its own. You built it independently. The question of Moss's motivations doesn't touch its validity. Tolland paused. What it does change is the scope. We're now looking at whether someone inside the program that was supposed to be providing oversight was compromised by the network that needed oversight. Emily absorbed that. How high does this go? We don't know yet. Tolland was honest about it, which Emily appreciated. Pharaoh is one node, Moss may be another. There may be others we haven't identified. The financial mapping is going to take weeks. And Pharaoh? State police found the rental vehicle at 0320 at a rest stop in Tennessee. Pharaoh was in it. He's in federal custody as of 0400. Emily set down her coffee cup. Something in her chest that had been held at a particular tension for 2 days shifted slightly, not releasing but reorganizing. Good, she said. Para. The days that followed had the particular texture of institutional aftermath, not dramatic, not resolved, just the slow grinding machinery of process doing what it was built to do. Emily remained on base under the investigation's operational protocols, which meant restricted movement and daily availability for questions that continued to come in from the IG team, from the JAG office, from the expanding federal case that now touched 4 installations and a regional command. She continued her nursing duties. This was not a coping mechanism or a performance of normalcy. It was what she did, and the ward didn't stop needing people because the administrative building was full of investigators. Sergeant Kowalski got his physical therapy sessions and complained about them in the specific way of someone who was improving and resented how hard improvement was. Specialist Reyes's fever resolved on day 3 with the adjusted antibiotic protocol Emily had recommended. Darren Ash, the young medic, sought her out twice that week to ask clinical questions, once about wound assessment, once about a patient interaction he'd found difficult, and both times she answered him the same way she answered everything, directly, without decorating it. On the 4th day, Yolanda Pruitt found her in the corridor outside Ward C. I heard about Moss, Yolanda said. She had the look of someone who'd been processing something for days and had arrived at a complicated place with it. The person who sent you here? Yes. Does that make everything you did? Yolanda stopped. I don't know what I'm asking. It doesn't change what's documented, Emily said. The evaluation stands. The complaints stand. The footage from the supply room stands. She looked at Yolanda steadily. The thing that happened to you and to the people who left before you, that's in the record. Moss's situation doesn't touch that. Yolanda was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about the people who transferred, the ones we knew were leaving because of Briggs, and most of us didn't say anything. We watched them go. I know. That's on us too. Not just on Briggs. Emily didn't contradict her because it was true, and Yolanda knew it was true, and sometimes the thing someone needs isn't to be told they're wrong about their own culpability. It's on everyone who was part of the system that let it run, she said, including the people who were scared and made the calculation that silence was safer. That's human. It's also a cost. Yolanda nodded. Is it going to actually change? After all this, is it actually going to be different? Emily thought about how to answer honestly. I don't know. I know that 7 complaint files that were closed are being reopened. I know that 3 installations are under review. I know that the people who built a system where silence was the only rational choice are being removed from positions where they can maintain that system. She paused. Whether what comes after is better depends on the people who fill those positions next. That's always the answer, and it's never a satisfying one. Yolanda looked at her for a long moment. You're not what I expected, she said, when you first got here. I thought you were just quiet. I was quiet. You know what I mean. Emily almost smiled. I know what you mean. The formal charges were filed in federal court 6 weeks after the Blackhawks landed on Silver Creek's eastern pad. Captain Nathan Briggs. Assault, abuse of authority, obstruction of official complaint proceedings. 3 counts across 2 installations beyond Silver Creek were added as the Fort Bellamy and Riverside Post files developed. His counsel negotiated on the peripheral charges and found no movement on the central ones. The assault footage was 47 seconds long and required no interpretation. Colonel Victor Hartwell, dereliction of duty, knowing concealment of fraudulent procurement activity, systematic obstruction of complaint resolution. His cooperation with the investigation saw limited, cautious, delivered through counsel, was noted in the charging documents but produced insufficient mitigation to avoid prosecution. Major Dennis Farrow, federal procurement fraud, theft of government property, creation of fraudulent financial instruments, obstruction. 19 counts across 4 installations. His attorney entered a not guilty plea that everyone in the room understood was an opening position, not a belief. Colonel Adrienne Moss, 2 counts of accepting payments connected to a procurement fraud scheme, 1 count of potential conflict of interest in program assignment. The charges were narrower than the others because the evidence was narrower. The transfers were documented, but her intent and the degree of her knowledge remained contested. She maintained that the transfers were personal loans from an individual she hadn't known was connected to the scheme. The investigation found this explanation incomplete, but not entirely disprovable. Emily read the charging documents in a conference room at the IG field office, where she'd been brought for a final formal review of her testimony record. She read them the way she read charts, carefully, looking for what the language was actually saying beneath the legal structure. Vasquez, who was seated across from her, waited until she'd finished. "Any corrections or additions to your prior testimony?" Vasquez asked. "No." "The documentation from your evaluation has been formally submitted to the DoD Medical Review Program's Oversight Committee and is being used as the foundational record for all 4 installation reviews." Vasquez set a sheet on the table. "This is the official acknowledgement of your evaluation's completion and acceptance." Emily looked at the sheet. It was in the dry language of official documents, a certificate of completion, the program's formal recognition that her assignment at Silver Creek had concluded and that her work product had been accepted as valid and comprehensive. In the box labeled Evaluator Assessment, it said, "Exceptional. Documentation complete, methodology sound, conclusions well supported." She'd seen this form before, at the end of her previous assignments. It had never felt like much. Bureaucratic completion, the paperwork equivalent of a period at the end of a sentence. This time she looked at it for a little longer than usual. "There's something else," Vasquez said. She set a second document on the table. "The IG office formally requested this from the Secretary of the Army's office yesterday. It was approved this morning." Emily read it. It was a letter of commendation, issued at the secretary level, citing her evaluation work, her conduct during the investigation, and, stated plainly, without the usual euphemistic buffering, her professionalism in the face of a hostile command environment and a physical assault. The language was specific. It named what had happened. It named what she had done in response. She hadn't known this was coming. Nobody had told her to expect it. She set the document down. She didn't have a clean response ready for it, which was unusual, and she didn't try to manufacture one. She sat with the slight discomfort of being recognized in a way that made her aware of how long she'd been operating in conditions where recognition was not part of the structure. "Thank you," she said, because it was true, and because sometimes the true thing was the simple one. And see, the hearing for Briggs's assault charge was public. Emily had been told it would be and had made no request for it to be otherwise. The public nature of it mattered, not for her personally, but because the 7 people from the previous installations whose complaints had been suppressed were watching, and because the people currently serving under commands like the one Silver Creek had been deserved to see what the process looked like when it actually ran. She testified for 2 hours and 14 minutes. She described what had happened in the supply room in the same flat, specific language she'd used in every statement since day one. She described the sound, she described the sequence, she described her response. She described the 8 words she'd said after, "We'll let the truth decide." And when the prosecuting attorney asked why she'd said that, she gave the same answer she'd been giving since the beginning. "Because I had documented evidence and I trusted the process," she said, "and because I wanted him to know he hadn't ended anything." Briggs's defense attorney asked her, on cross-examination, whether her classified status at the time of the incident meant she had been operating under a kind of professional protection that an ordinary nurse would not have had. Emily looked at the attorney with the particular patience of someone who'd been waiting for that question. "The footage from the supply room shows what happened regardless of who I was or what I was doing there. The question of whether I had professional protection doesn't change what he did. It changes whether he thought he could get away with it." The attorney moved on. In the gallery, Emily recognized several faces from the ward. Yolanda Pruitt, in civilian clothes, sitting in the 3rd row with her hands folded and her expression doing the thing it did when she was deciding something. Marcus Webb beside her. Darren Ash near the end of the row. And in the 2nd row, in a seat that required presence and choice and the understanding that whatever complicated feelings existed were less important than being there, Peta Faleolo, the lab tech who had known something was wrong from month 3 and had made the calculation that silence was safer and had been living with that calculation ever since. Emily didn't acknowledge them from the stand. It wasn't the moment for it, but she saw them. She registered them the same way she registered most things, not with performance, but with the quiet note-taking of someone who understood that the details were the whole story. Briggs was convicted on the assault charge before the week was out. The abuse of authority counts took longer. 3 weeks of proceedings that produced the kind of testimony from Fort Bellamy and Riverside Post that made the room go quiet in the particular way of rooms that are absorbing something they already suspected and are now being forced to confirm. 7 people, 7 accounts, 7 instances of the same machinery running the same outcome: complaint filed, complaint managed, person transferred, record closed. The judge sentenced Briggs to federal prison, 22 months on the assault conviction, concurrent with additional time on the abuse of authority charges. He was stripped of his rank and pension. The military separation was automatic given the federal conviction. Hartwell received a separate sentence on the concealment and obstruction charges. 14 months, suspended to 8 with conditions. He was removed from command, stripped of his commission, and banned from federal employment. The conditions of his suspended sentence required ongoing cooperation with the broader procurement fraud investigation. Farrow's case took longer. The 19 counts across 4 installations produced a trial that ran 6 weeks and featured financial testimony that was technical enough to require 2 expert witnesses to translate for the jury. He was convicted on 16 of 19 counts. The sentence was 12 years. Moss entered a plea agreement on the 2 accepted payment counts in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation into the program's oversight failures. The plea resulted in a reduced charge, a fine, and a permanent bar from federal employment. She did not receive prison time. The prosecution's position was that her knowledge was incomplete and her involvement peripheral. Her defense maintained she'd been deceived. The truth was probably somewhere between those positions and the complicated middle ground where most human culpability actually lived. Emily did not attend Moss's hearing. She had been asked if she wanted to provide a victim impact statement for the Briggs sentencing, which was standard procedure. She'd thought about it for 2 days. She'd written 3 drafts and deleted all of them because they all did the thing she'd spent 6 months training herself not to do: editorialize when the facts were enough. She submitted a single paragraph. It described the assault. It described the professional context. It described the choice she'd made to trust the process rather than the institution. It ended, "I am submitting this statement not for my own sake, but for the record, so that the people who came before me at this installation and at others whose complaints were filed and then made to disappear have documentation that their experience was real, was wrong, and was seen." She never read it aloud. She didn't need to. Okay. 3 months after the Blackhawks landed and 6 months after Emily Carter had walked into Silver Creek Medical Center with a contractor badge and a Tier 2 designation and the accumulated knowledge of a decade of service she'd never volunteered to explain, the DoD Medical Review Program held what it called a formal program review. The review was not public. It produced a document that was classified at the program level, but whose key findings were summarized in a congressional oversight memo that became part of the public record. The summary described systematic gaps in evaluator protection protocols, conflicts of interest in assignment procedures, and insufficient independence between program personnel and the regional command structures they were designed to review. Emily was asked to provide input to the review. She provided 22 pages of specific documented recommendations. She did not soften them. Several were adopted. Not all. The process of institutional reform was, as she'd told Yolanda, always dependent on the people who came next, and that was never a guarantee and rarely a comfort. But several were adopted. The complaint resolution audit system that she'd identified as a critical gap was redesigned. The protocol for evaluator contact information was restructured to separate personal information from program files accessible at the regional level. The assignment process now required a conflict of interest review for all program supervisors before target selection. She was offered a promotion within the program, a senior evaluation role, more oversight responsibility, larger installation scope. The kind of position that was a recognition of what she'd done and a bet on what she could keep doing. She took 2 weeks to decide. She'd spent 6 months in a medical wing, and what she'd found there, beneath all the investigation and the documentation and the institutional machinery, was that she'd missed the work. Not the evaluation work, though she was good at it and it mattered. the clinical work, the wound packing that had to be right, the antibiotic protocol that needed adjustment, the young medic who asked questions in the hallway because he was trying to get better and needed someone to show him how. She took the senior evaluation role and negotiated a provision that kept her in active clinical practice on rotation, 12 weeks per year minimum, because she'd learned the hard way that institutions that lost their clinical grounding stopped understanding what they were actually supposed to protect. The program director, newly appointed after the review, had looked at her proposed provision and said, "That's unusual." "Yes," she'd agreed. "It is." He'd approved it. The last morning before she left Silver Creek, she did one more round of Ward C. Kowalski had been discharged 2 weeks earlier, walking without a limp he'd been told to expect for months, because he'd done his physical therapy instead of avoiding it. Reyes had returned to duty. The ward had new faces. It always did, rotation being the constant of military medical installations. Darren Ash was at the nurses' station when she came through, updating a chart with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that the documentation was part of the care. He looked up when he heard her. "You're leaving today," he said. "Yes." He set down the chart. He had something he wanted to say and was trying to find the right frame for it, which she recognized as a thing young people did when they'd been thinking about something for a while and weren't sure if it was appropriate to voice. "The stuff that happened," he said. "The investigation. All of it." He paused. "I've been here 8 months. I didn't see any of it. I mean, I felt something was off sometimes, but I didn't see it." "You weren't looking for it," Emily said. "That's not a criticism. You were doing your job." "But you were doing your job too, the same job, and you saw it." She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I was looking for it. That was the difference." She picked up a chart from the rack, not because she needed it, but because the motion gave the conversation somewhere to go. "You're going to be in a lot of institutions over your career. Some of them are going to feel wrong in ways you can't immediately name. When that happens," she set the chart down. "Don't wait until you're sure enough. File what you see, date it, keep a copy. The system only works when people actually use it." He nodded slowly. "What if the system is the problem? Then you go around it. You find the channel that exists outside the broken one. It always exists. You have to know where to look." She paused. "And if you can't find it, you call someone who can. That's not failure. That's how it's supposed to work." He looked at her for a long moment. "You changed this place." She thought about Yolanda's statement and Peta's decision to sit in the second row of the gallery and Marcus Webb saying, "I should have done something," and then doing something. She thought about 7 reopened complaint files and an audit system that worked differently now, and a young medic in a ward that was, in small and imperfect ways, less frightening than it had been. "No," she said. "A lot of people changed it. I just documented the part that made the change possible." She said goodbye to the ward the way she'd arrived, quietly, without ceremony, without making it about the leaving. She picked up her bag from her quarters. She signed her final checkout form at the administrative desk, which was staffed now by people she recognized, in a building that felt different than it had the first time she'd walked through it, because it was different. Not fixed, not solved, but moving in a direction with documentation to back it up. She walked out to the parking lot. The sky was the kind of clear that came after a long stretch of gray, the light coming in flat and honest across the eastern pad where, 3 months ago, 2 Blackhawks had touched down and changed the geometry of this place. Her car was where she'd left it. She put her bag in the back seat. She sat for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about being 30 years old with a badge that said Tier 2, medical support, and a history that nobody had thought to ask about, and a room full of people who'd assumed they knew what she was. She thought about the specific weight of being underestimated, how it was simultaneously a vulnerability and a position, how people who didn't see you couldn't prepare for you. She thought about the slap that had been intended to end something, about the 8 words she'd said after, about the fact that she'd meant them without knowing, in that moment, exactly how they'd come true. We'll let the truth decide. The truth had decided. Loudly, specifically, with court documents and federal charges, and 7 reopened files and a congressional oversight memo and a letter from the Secretary of the Army that she kept not because it made her feel vindicated, but because it was evidence, and she believed in evidence. She was not the same person who'd walked into Silver Creek 6 months ago, though the changes were not the kind that showed. She was more certain of some things and less certain of others, which was usually what growth felt like from the inside. Not expansion, but recalibration. A better instrument, not a bigger one. She started the car. Her phone showed a message from the new program director, confirming her first assignment under the senior role. A different installation, different region, different faces, the same work. The kind of work that only got done when someone decided that watching and saying nothing was a price they weren't willing to pay. She pulled out of the parking lot. She didn't look back at the building. She'd seen everything in it that needed seeing. There was a particular kind of strength that didn't announce itself, that didn't stand in doorways or make speeches or need the room to understand what it was. It just did the work, documented what it found, trusted the truth to be enough, and when the truth needed help, provided it. Emily Carter had been dismissed, struck, and told she was finished. She had said 8 words and meant all of them. The road ahead was long and straight and entirely hers.